We're live now. Welcome everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us today for Case Western Reserve University's Conversations. The session today is about research, working in research. Research is such an integral part of the student experience at Case Western Reserve University. About 80% of our undergraduate students are involved in research or creative endeavors by the time they graduate from the university. And so to speak about their experiences as undergrads that did research, we have three of our alums today, Nate, Mahima, and Brian, who are going to be sharing their experiences with you, what that was like doing research at Case Western Reserve University, and how that prepared them for what they are currently doing. So without much further ado, I am going to hand things over to our alums to introduce themselves. So if you guys could please talk about what majors you pursued at the university, what you were involved in as undergrad students at Case Western Reserve University. Give us a brief overview of your research as an undergrad, and then talk a little bit about what you're currently doing. That would be great. And if I could have you go in the order of, I'll have you go in the order Nate, Mahima, then Brian. That would be great. So Nate, over to you.
Okay. Well, hello, everyone watching. My name is Nate Mullen. I graduated from Case in 2016. I majored in biology and philosophy as a double major, which I enjoyed a lot. At Case, I was in Radhika Atit's lab in the Department of Biology for 3 years. I spent one summer there and one summer in a collaborator's lab in Boston, and I studied Wnt signaling and non-coding RNAs, basically signaling pathways in skin fibrosis. And I had a great experience with that. After I graduated, I worked as a technician in a lab at Boston Children's Hospital doing stem cell research. And in 2018, I started in the MD PhD program at the University of Iowa, where I am now in my second year, doing stem cell research still. So I think that covered all the questions. Maybe.
No, thank you. So then we'll go over to you, Mahima.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mahima. I graduated from Case Western in 2017. I studied biology. I minored in philosophy, for what that's worth. A lot. While I was there, I was also in Radhika Atit's lab in the Department of Biology. I studied, my project was craniofacial development, so how the tissues of the head and the face form in like kind of the early embryo stages. And right now I am in an MD PhD program at the University of Minnesota. And for those who don't know what that is, it's medical school with research years incorporated into the program. So as you can imagine, my research experience at Case Western was very informative in me choosing this career path.
All right, thank you. And then Brian.
Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Lurch. I graduated just this past summer, actually. I majored in both biology and math while I was at Case. While I was there, really from my first semester, I worked in a lab that did theoretical ecology and evolutionary biology. So basically that just means I studied mathematical models of ecology and evolution. In particular, I was interested in social behavior and reproductive behaviors and how those can evolve and what the implications, ecological implications of those are. Kind of as a result of that, I was able to have a couple of summer programs that I also did at Michigan State and University of Tennessee. Currently, I'm at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in the biology department, studying more or less the exact same type of things I was studying up at Case, ecology and evolution of behavior.
All right. Thank you all so much for sharing that background information. Now, before we actually kick off with, some of the things that I'm curious to hear your perspective on, I'm actually curious, how did you all end up at Case Western Reserve University? Can you talk a little bit about your pathway to to getting to Case Western Reserve? What is it that got you to enroll at the university? And again, if we can go in the same order we started before, so Nate, starting with you, that'd be great.
Sure. So I wasn't sure what I wanted to do career-wise necessarily. I had like an inclination toward science and biology, medicine type stuff. But in high school, I had some exposure to lab research. So I thought that that was something I wanted to do in college as well. And when I was sort of visiting colleges, I don't know, I felt like it was very, I mean, I'm not just saying this because of the topic of the call, but I felt like it was the kind of place where undergrads could like work in a lab. I didn't really know that much about working in a lab, but just broadly, it felt like that was a possibility. I don't know, I'm from the Boston area originally, and I kind of wanted to move to a different part of the country. So that was part of it. I liked Cleveland a lot when I visited, but yeah, I don't know. I think the size and the ability for undergrads to actually work in the lab was kind of major things for me when I was deciding where to go.
All right, thanks so much, Nate and Mahima.
Yeah, so for me, Case kind of checked all the boxes, if you will. So when I was applying to schools, I knew like vaguely I was interested in medicine, but that was no means kind of a sure bet. So, but I wanted that aspect of my education to, at least to be fulfilled. So kind of when I was looking at schools, I knew I wanted a place where I'd have access to research opportunities. I remember attending a session like this when I was a prospective student, like, okay, I'd have kind of a diverse range of research experiences available to me. I knew there were hospitals nearby, so I'd have, opportunities to shadow and possibly volunteer in that setting. The pre-medical curriculum was recommended, and, I was told that it would prepare you well enough for medical school. And, now having gone through the first couple of years of medical school, I'd say that's pretty much true. So in a lot of ways, that's what I mean by, hey, Case tick the boxes. Like, there were things that I was specifically looking for, and I found those opportunities here.
Right, thank you. And then Brian.
Yeah, I guess going to show why we're all on this panel, a big reason that I ended up at Case was because of research opportunities. That easily was the #1 biggest reason. When I was visiting different schools, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I didn't even know what specific field of science I was most interested in. I just knew that I loved science and wanted to do science. And I felt like I would have the opportunity to do that at Case and to really take things in any direction that I wanted to and just sort of follow what my interests were, and be able to explore that in different research opportunities that were available at Case. So that was the biggest reason. It also, I'm from Dayton, Ohio, which is about 3 hours away. And that felt like the perfect distance for me. So that was another feature of it was just sort of location, but that's somewhat specific.
Okay, thank you all again. So, one of the things that, or one of the questions that we always hear students ask about in the admission world, certainly when they're considering Case Western Reserve University, like you all, certainly, it sounds like you are all very interested in research as high school students. And we see this a lot in students that are interested in the university. So when you all came in as undergrads, how did you go about then looking for those opportunities, given that you already had this interest in high school? Were you cold emailing professors, or did you take advantage of formal structures within the university to sort of help you find those opportunities? So I'll start with Brian, since you're the most recent grad, and then go with Mahima and Nate in that order.
Yeah, so when I first got to school, first got to Case, everyone sort of told me I should hold off and get my feet under me before I really pursued research opportunities. And after 1 week, I decided that I had had enough of that. And actually, in literally my second week there, I started emailing professors. I sent 7 emails, and I actually got a response from all of them, which I think goes to show something that, you know, they are interested in hearing from undergrads. I think 3 labs were willing to discuss things further. And the other ones were all saying, you know, well, we don't have any opportunities now, but feel free to get back in touch. And really what I was planning on doing from there was to actually bounce around between labs, but it turned out I found something I wanted to do right off the bat. So yeah, for me, it was really just finding what I thought was interesting and reaching out to professors because of that.
Okay, thank you. Mahima?
Yeah, so when I first started at Case, you know, I'd kind of heard both recommendations. One, to, you know, join a lab right away, you know, start your experience early, and then on the other side, you know, hold off, ease yourself in. And you know, when I think back to my freshman year, I'm not sure I would have necessarily wanted the extra responsibility of being in a lab, but I am glad I started in my sophomore year, because I think, you know, you need a certain number of years under your belt to kind of develop a level of autonomy in the lab and kind of get a good sense of what's going on and start asking your own questions. But in terms of actually finding professors, I think, you know, if you take a class with a professor, that's like an easy connection that you've already made, especially if you found yourself, you know, engaged with a particular aspect of the coursework. It's a good place to, you know, set up a conversation with the professor. And even if you don't start research, if you show, or if you're, you know, able to have a conversation about a particular topic, maybe that professor can direct you towards people doing that kind of work. There's also an office at Case called the Source Office. And every month or every couple of weeks, they would have a morning session, how to find a research lab. And I went to one of these sessions and, you know, they showed you how to draft an email to a professor, how to, like, what to include, you know, how you should tweak your resume. And when I took a class with Dr. Teet and I found that, you know, embryology and stem cell biology was really interesting to me, I went to one of these sessions and sent her an email and sent a couple other, you know, people studying stem cell biology an email. And that's how I ended up joining the lab.
Thanks again. And then Nate.
Yeah. So I guess this was advice everyone was getting. Didn't plan to join a lab until sophomore year. It worked out fine. At the end of freshman year, I sort of had connected with a biology professor that I got along with, and I think I was asking her advice about getting involved in a lab, if I remember correctly. In high school, I had some exposure to zebrafish research. And there was like one zebrafish lab, so I just figured that sounds easy. I'll try to do the same thing. And then through this professor, I got introduced to Dr. Atit, who does mouse work, and it was kind of different than what I had had any experience with. But I don't know, we just talked about it, and then I started in the fall of my sophomore year. But yeah, I don't know. I felt like the whole department, at least in biology, was very welcoming to students who wanted to get involved in research. All the faculty, you know, it's pretty close-knit type of feeling. So I felt like they talked to each other. And if I hadn't joined a TEAT lab, I think you know, they would have helped me get into a different lab. So that was a nice feeling. It wasn't like, join or I'm never going to speak to you again. So yeah.
Okay. And you guys brought up something interesting that I want to do a bit of a contrast, if you will. And I'll actually pose this to Brian and Nate more specifically. Could you talk a little bit, kind of given where you are now and everything that you know at this point in time, if you could advise, you know, prospective students coming in between going for research that you're interested in versus just going for research, where obviously, Brian, sounds like you got involved in research that you were actually interested in. It's something you continue to do in your program now. And then Nate, you contrast that a little bit. Sounds like you were just looking to get involved in research and had the opportunity to do so in Dr. Atid's lab. But could you talk about how that experience ended out for you? And then Brian, so if Nate, you could go first, and then Brian after.
Sure. I mean, at least in my case, I think broadly I was interested in biology type research, which is a very broad field. So I think if you're someone like that, I don't know how other fields are, but at least for me, I think it would have been a mistake to say, like, at 18, I'm a zebrafish guy and I'm going to be a zebrafish guy for the rest of my life and never explore anything else. So I thought it was great. I mean, I think that especially as an undergrad, if you find a mentor that you feel like you can connect with, and even if they do something, I mean, this is the same advice in grad school that we get, but I think it applies. If you find like it's a good lab environment and the field is maybe slightly different than anything you've ever been exposed to, it's a great opportunity to learn more. And you're not getting, I mean, what research you do in undergrad you can continue on in it, but you can also change what you do a little bit later. I mean, in my grad school lab, no one said, wait, aren't you like a fibrosis? Why do you want to do stem cell research? I think, it's all, you can always change at any stage, I think. So it's a great opportunity to try something new if that seems good to you.
Okay, yeah. And then Brian, let's get your take on that.
Yeah, I really tend to agree with pretty much everything you just said, Nate. I think that in some sense, obviously you want to follow your interests, right? And for me, the best thing that I could do was just go on the webpage of all of the research that was being done and departments I was interested in and just see what caught my eye, reach out to those professors. But in some sense, you also don't know what you're going to be interested in until you do it. And that can go in both directions, right? Of course, you could sort of start doing something and realize it's really cool. I actually had the opposite experience, and sort of not with any hard feelings, but I worked in a wet lab briefly and realized that experiments were not for me, which is why I guess I'm an applied mathematician now. Only in doing it could I realize that, though. And now that I realize it, it sort of helped me follow down a path that is more suitable for sort of what I like to do. So I think that, within that bubble of things you think you might be interested in, it's worth sort of exploring. But obviously it's important to care about what you're doing, or else, I mean, I don't really think there's much of a point, right?
Okay, thank you both. And then that brings me to sort of the next point I thought of. I mean, you guys were pretty busy as undergrads, so for you, Brian, double major in biology and math. Mahima, you did biology, philosophy minor. Nate, biology, philosophy double major. And then on top of that, you guys said in your introductions the different things you were involved in. So it sounds like you had quite a few things on your plate. With all of that, given with all of your academic workload, I should say, and the extracurricular demands you had, what did fitting in research look like? What was the workload, the time, the hour requirement for, or workload, if you would, for your research projects? And how did you fit all of that in? How were you able to handle it all? So Mahima, if you'd start, and then Brian, Nate after.
Yeah, it's a good question, and with very varied responses. My personal experience is that when I got to the point where, when I was in the lab and, I'd been there long enough to kind of be asking my own questions, like designing my own experiments, there was nothing that could pull me away from the lab. So I found it to be kind of a very consuming experience, but in the best way possible, in the way that, I had other responsibilities, I had classes, I had extracurriculars, but it became a very important part of my life, because to me, it was, it grew from, just learning about research to like into this process of, discovery. And, like even to a romantic extent, like learning, like discovering the truth about science. And that's what the experience became, after I'd been in the lab for over a year, almost 2.5 years. So I would say by the time I got to my senior year, and I was trying to finish experiments before I graduated, it did consume a lot of my time. That being said, I worked in the lab in the summers too. And when you work in the summer, it's just kind of like a full-time job, a job that you would have in any other place. The nice thing is, if you get to the point in your research where you're making your own schedule, then you can work it in well with your other responsibilities.
Okay, and then Brian?
Yeah, it's sort of a tough question because, I wasn't like keeping track. So I don't really know exactly how much time I was spending. I was certainly busy. I think everyone, just in college is busy. Definitely, I would say the last 2 years, I probably actually spent more time working on research than I did on classes, which was not that I had to, it was just that sort of I was interested in it. And that's how I was spending my time. That's not to say I wasn't doing other things, but I just had the flexibility to work on how much I wanted to be working on. And it turned out that, I was spending considerable amount of time on that. My personal experience was that I had a lot of flexibility. This is probably partly a result of the fact that I was in a theoretical lab. And I think that you're less prone to just being plugged into existing projects that way. So I really had kind of a lot of freedom. Nobody was waiting on me if I didn't get something done. So in that sense, in weeks that I was busy, I certainly could put it aside, focus on classes, focus on personal things, if that was coming up as well. So it varied a lot.
Okay, thanks, Ryan. Nate?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo, I guess, again, acknowledging that we're all people who love research, and that's why we're talking to you. It was definitely my favorite thing to do in terms of school. So yeah, I loved it, but definitely for me, the calculation was just trying to not be in the lab instead of studying if I should have been studying for a class or something. But yeah, I mean, it was definitely possible to balance. I think when I sort of got the idea that I wanted to go to med school and stuff, it just emphasizes even more that you have to be trying to do as well as you can in classes and stuff. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely possible to manage. I guess the thing I wanted to add was, at least in my experience, and I think this is probably true for a lot of PIs who take on undergrads at Case, if they're taking you on to like do a project and be in their lab for an extended period of time, they want you to be successful in all realms of your life. Like, you're not going to stay at undergrad forever, and you're not going to just work in your lab. So I never felt like my PI, I mean, it's definitely the opposite of this. She would never say, oh, I want you to do that experiment. I don't care if you fail your test. I mean, she way emphasized being balanced and balancing schoolwork, and was very flexible with that. I remember when I took the MCAT, I just said to her, like, after winter break, I'm not going to be able to come in for a week or something, or 2 weeks. I forget how long it was, but she was very supportive of that. They want you to move on to the next thing and not have spend too much time doing lab work that you aren't able to do what you want after you graduate.
Okay. Thank you all again so much. But I want to actually pivot back to something that Mahima mentioned, that her research project was a full-time job, essentially over the course of the summer. Take it you stayed on campus to continue research during that point in time. But that brings me to something. When you stayed on campus for the summer, having that be a full-time job, then was your research paid? And how was that funded? Was that funded through grants? Specifically for you, Mahima, if you want to touch on that. And Nate, I know your project was paid as well in a sense. So after Mahima, if you want to touch on that a little bit as well.
Yeah, so during the school year, the academic semesters, I took research for credit. So I would go into the lab for, X number of hours, and, I'd get some number of credits for it. During the summers, I applied to different sources of funding. And so there are two grants that I got. One was the SOURCE grant, and another was called Engage. And these they give you a stipend to work for 10 weeks full-time, and they're usually accompanied, in addition with the stipend, they're usually accompanied with sessions on how to make a poster, how to give a good presentation, how to, how to network, things like that. But the portions of my research that were paid over the 2.5 years, the portions that were paid were only the summers. So the 2 summers I was in.
Yeah.
Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was in a similar position. We were in the same lab. I guess we mentioned that. But for the first summer, I applied for those grants. I don't think I got them, but I ended up getting funded just through the Department of Biology. So it worked out. I mean, again, I think at least my feeling from in the biology department, at least, they weren't looking to make it so someone couldn't do research over the summer if they had a good project and were in a lab. So I felt like everyone, the administrators in the department and the PIs were all, trying to make it work and trying to get people in a position where they could do what they wanted. And then the next summer, I went to a lab at Boston University that we collaborated with and was just paid as a summer student. So again, yeah, I got paid for both summers and took it for class credit during the year.
Okay, thank you both. And another theme that sort of emerged there is the theme of class credit. And Mahima, Nate, you've both kind of touched on that. I'd like to hear what your experience was like trying to get the credit for that, for the research that you did. Just how easy was it to do that? What was involved in that sort of process? And specifically for Brian, and I actually want to start with you, Brian. Your research was interdisciplinary in nature. So if you did get credit for it, did you get to decide what department it fell in? Did it go into math or biology? How did that work? So if you want to start, then Nate, Mahima.
Yeah, so to touch on the first thing you said, it was extremely easy to get credit for it. In the biology department, at least while I was there, it was a requirement to get some research credit. And the fact that it was a requirement in biology is sort of the answer to your second question as well. For me, I actually don't know about how I could get it to fall in different departments because it was a requirement for biology. It wasn't for the math degree. So it was, and my PI was in the biology department. So it was, I never really looked into that. So I'm not sure about that second point, but in terms of getting credit, it was very straightforward.
Yeah, for me too, it was very easy. I remember I knew from the beginning, I was like, I'll just max out. If I can get credit for doing lab work that I think I would have been doing anyway, I'll do it. So I think there were a few courses. I mean, I was just working in the lab every semester and I could sign up and get course credit for one semester. I think some of them were pass-fail and some were graded maybe. And then you could also get credit. Your Capstone project was in the lab too. But so that was all good. I can talk I also did an independent study, which was sort of like a research project in the Department of Philosophy. So that was easy to set up too. I think my feeling on both of those was if you have a lab or a PI that you're working with who can vouch for the project that you're doing and everything, it felt like the department was very easy to work with and get signed up for those.
Okay. And Mahima, before I get your take on that, just want to let the audience know that you can definitely ask questions in the Q&A tab, and we'll be able to post some of them to our panelists after, well, in a little bit. Obviously, we won't be able to get to everyone's questions because we have about 300 attendees right now, but we'll try our best to kind of cover some general themes. And then Mahima, after you speak to that, I want to come back to you, Nate, to touch on that independent study in philosophy. Was it research-based? How did that work?
So in terms of research for credit, to echo everyone, it was very easy. You sign up for it when you sign up for the rest of your classes. It's as easy as plugging it in. There is some formula, some recommended formula for X number of credits for X number of hours in the lab. So if I recall correctly, the estimate is 1 credit is 4 hours per week in the lab. But I have found, at least in my experience, that is a very incorrect assessment of how much time you actually spend. So, the credit for a lot of people is more just to supplement your time spent in the lab, and then just use that kind of credit per hours spent as like a guideline if you're unsure of how much time is spent. Incidentally, I also did an independent study, but in the English department. So I can talk a little bit about that.
And was that research-based?
It was not research-based. It was not related to my research in any way.
Okay, so we'll touch, Nate, if you want to touch base about your philosophy independent study, and then Mahima, since we're already on the topic, you can touch base a little bit about yours as well.
Yeah, I mean, mine was not, it wasn't related to my biology department research. It was just there's a bioethics professor, and I had taken all his courses offered to undergrads, and then basically I was just got off on this little offshoot writing a research paper with him as an independent study about personalized medicine, some of the topics that were raised in his classes. So yeah, it was just over a semester, but it was a nice experience too. I mean, it was great to be able to work with a professor and in fields other than biology. I don't know how it is in other things. There's not like a bioethics lab or something. So we would just meet and work on that together. But yeah, that was nice.
Okay, thank you. Mahima?
Yeah, in my experience, the independent study was exactly that. It's self-directed. So you work with the professor and you kind of come up with the game plan. And you can take the independent study for 1 to 3 credits. And that kind of determines how much time you spend on it over the semester, and it usually culminates in a project. So I was interested in writing. That was a little side project of mine. I was particularly interested in comedy writing and satire. So I constructed an independent study on the history of satire and satirical works. And it was just really fun to do. It was completely unrelated to my research in every single way. But it was kind of a nice little outlet that I could spend time on and think deeply about and then get credit for.
Thank you. Now, kind of looking at some of the questions coming in, starting to see some themes here. So just gonna pick out some of those themes that are coming into the Q&A box, and we can chat a little bit about those. So one of the ones that is just really sticking out here is sort of opportunities available to present your work. Is this an opportunity did any of you have this opportunity, whether it was to publish your work, take part in the research expo or anything like that? So Brian, I want you and Mahima to answer this part.
Yeah, so in terms of presenting at conferences there's plenty of opportunities for that. So CASE every spring they put on, actually I think at the end of every semester, they put on, it's called the Research Showcase, and it's basically a giant poster session where all the undergrads that are most of the undergrads doing research present posters, faculty will come, and you just have the opportunity to chat with sort of the whole campus about what you've been doing. After my junior year, I went to ESA, which is a national conference in ecology, and gave a talk there. And that was able to be funded through my lab. So that was a really cool opportunity, both professionally and just as sort of a free vacation, which is half the reason to go to conferences, I think. In terms of publications, that's another thing that certainly there's the opportunity for. I was actually able to submit a paper my sophomore year from research that I was doing as a freshman. I now have 3 publications from when I was an undergrad, and another one that's sort of in the works. So it's very much something that you can do, and yeah.
Okay, thank you. Mahima?
Yeah, I think Brian really hit all the big points there. CASE does have those opportunities for presenting posters of your research. The 2 grants I mentioned before, the Source Grant and the Engage Grant, if you get the grant, the requirement is, as a part of the agreement with the stipend, is you're required to present your poster at one of their symposiums. So at the end of the summer, Engage had all the students who had gotten the Engage grant, and you presented your poster in a poster session. And I would echo what Brian said about publications. I think a lot of it is lab specific and also timing specific. Nobody would complain about getting a publication, but there's a lot of kind of serendipity involved there. If you're on the right project at the right time, it gets published very quickly, and then sometimes it takes much longer, and it's sometimes not a reflection of how hard you work, but it's just a matter of luck and reviewers being in a good mood, and it's a combination of things. But PIs know that especially if you're interested in medicine or interested in graduate school, PIs know that publications are important and will hold a lot of weight in your application, and no PI doesn't have publishing in the back of their mind. So the opportunities are available.
All right, Mahima, to kind of expand more on what you were saying. So during the summer when you were doing research, did you have housing provided on campus? What was your housing situation?
There was no housing provided by the program, but I was able to find apartments in Cleveland, pretty close to campus, within walking distance. I lived on campus housing for all 4 years, with the exception of the summers. The summers I lived with some roommates in the kind of local Cleveland area.
Okay. And then it just occurred to me that we've been talking a lot about research and PIs without actually ever defining what a PI is. So Nate, this falls on you. Could you please tell our audience what we mean by PI?
Yeah, so that's just the principal investigator of the lab, the head of the lab, basically. So that's the professor whose name is on the lab in most cases. I guess that's a good enough explanation probably to know what we're talking about.
Yeah, no, thank you. And then a theme that's coming in the Q&A section as well is just give me a sec, just kind of lost this here. Yeah. So were you all able to at any point work on your own research projects, or were you working on projects that graduate students in the lab perhaps were working on, or projects that the faculty or the PIs were working on? Did you have an opportunity at any point to branch off and sort of work on your own thing? Now, for anyone that actually had the opportunity to do so, if you could just show your hand, so we just have whoever did that actually speak. Okay, so everyone. So I'm gonna have Nate start, and then Brian touch on that as well.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think so. Whatever you work on in the lab is going to be under the umbrella of what the PI wants to work on in some way. In my case, which is just to say, like, you can't, as an undergrad or as a grad student or anyone, you're not going to go in and be like, I'm studying something completely unrelated to what the lab does. Yeah, so that's how it relates to that. In my experience, I started working very closely with a grad student, an MD PhD student who was in the lab actually, on her project, and she was, teaching me different techniques and stuff like that. So the first project that I worked on was kind of under her, and then when I had my first summer in the lab, I started working kind of full-time on my own project that was an idea that came about from talking to the PI. It was something that she had wanted to try, basically looking at this certain class of RNA molecule, how that might play into our model system. But yeah, that sort of got developed over the summer, but it was still, I guess what I'm saying is an offshoot of stuff that was going on in the lab, which I think is a great model. I think in my mind, if you want to be as productive as possible, you're going to work in a lab for like 3 to 4 years as an undergrad, not full-time all the time. And you're not going to be able to start a brand new from scratch research project with a new mouse and everything. So if you can have some little piece of a project that already exists and the resources and techniques are already in the lab and you can learn them, that's an ideal setting, I think. But you still have ownership and you still get to learn how to ask a research question and how to write up the results and everything like that. I think that's ideal.
Okay, thank you. Brian?
Yeah, so my answer to this is definitely colored by the fact that I was doing theoretical work and not in a wet lab, but I actually only did my own research. I showed up and essentially was told, like, figure out what you think is interesting and we'll figure out how to model it. And certainly that's something you probably couldn't do with bench work, but I sort of had a ton of flexibility in terms of just within the umbrella that was a pretty large umbrella, really just to find what was interesting. And I wasn't totally out on my own. That's not at all what I'm saying, but really being able to develop questions myself with input and feedback from people that were experts in related questions and really have some ownership over the types of things that I was doing and thinking about. That was absolutely an opportunity.
Okay, thank you, Brian. And then this question, I'll have go more to Mahima. And given that you and Nate worked in the same lab, that just kind of kills two birds with one stone. But what was, I guess, the diversity of academic interest within your lab? Did all students have to be bio majors, or perhaps did it seem to you like every student in the lab was a bio major, or in the biological sciences, or was there a bit more diversity than that?
Give me a second. Okay. I think the vast majority, at least when I was in the lab, a vast majority of the undergrads were bio majors. I think we had, one history/English major come through the lab, but who was pre-med. I don't think we had anyone who was not interested or not in biology or not pre-med in the lab.
Okay, thank you. And then Brian, if you could touch on this, we've spoken, kind of touched a little bit on capstone projects, but can you tell us a little bit about, well, what is the capstone project? Essentially, all the students at the university have to do one by the time they graduate. And can you talk about your capstone experience? What was your project on?
Yeah, so the capstone is essentially just a research project that you do for your major. I'm pretty sure in the biology department, at least, it can either be sort of like, I'll say library work in terms of synthesizing something, or it could be sort of wet lab or sort of original research. So yeah, that was something that was a really cool opportunity, just to kind of have a more formal setup. For me, when I was doing my capstone, I had already been in the lab, so I was able to really just extend stuff that I was already working on and already knew I was interested in into that project.
Okay, thank you. And then, obviously, when students go to an institution like Case Western Reserve University or any other research institution, I'd say in the country, one of the things that sort of influences that decision is the hope that that research they get to do as undergrad really prepares them for what they plan to do post-graduation, be it grad professional studies in general. So in your view, how did your research experience at Case Western Reserve University prepare you for what you went on to do post-graduation? And I'll start with you, Nate, then Mahima and Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I thought I think it was a great preparation, basically, is the bottom line. I see, like, there's a few aspects to it. You know, you have the specific thing that you're studying, which is useful, I think, like, but it's not generally that broad, but you do know about like Wnt signaling and non-coding RNAs and stuff, and those like come up in life later on. So that was nice. But the other thing is like you learn a lot of techniques. So for me, that was great. Being able to say I know how to do a PCR and stuff like that was nice for finding a job as a technician afterwards. Really, all those techniques were really useful. And then I guess the third thing is just learning how an academic lab works, I think was very useful, especially if you can find a lab where you can sort of have some ownership over a project and see how papers are written and understand all that. I think all that's really important. You know, it's like a different world in some ways that you wouldn't be exposed to otherwise. So I think just getting exposed to that will help you in grad school, or if you try to get a job in a lab after college. Just have a sense of how everything works, you know, what the different PI and the postdoc and things like that mean. It's somewhat basic, but I think that that's useful knowledge, and you can only get it by actually working in a lab for some period of time.
Okay, thank you. Mahima?
And I agree wholeheartedly with everything Nate just said. The only thing I would add is a phrase that got thrown around in our lab a lot was how to think like a scientist. And that was, at least in my mind, a little bit of a paradigm shift from, you know, thinking, you know, like you would in the classroom, which is a little bit kind of, to some extent, passive. You know, you're absorbing information. But when you're in the lab and you're kind of running experiments and you're making observations and hypotheses, testing those, you start to develop a certain way of thinking about science and about problems. And I think this is a skill that you develop over time. And, you know, if all your experiments fail, but you're able to develop, you know, kind of this certain type of systematic thinking, I would call that research experience a success overall. And I think that is one thing that I learned in the ATIT lab that has prepared me really well for future labs, because it doesn't matter what the subject matter is, you know, because your process of thinking is somewhat established.
Thank you. Brian?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with sort of the sentiment that the opportunities with research at Case were able to set me up very well for coming to grad school. I really felt like I hit the ground running in terms of, already knowing what it takes to develop a research project, do a research project and get it published. I felt like I already understood that process. I didn't feel like I had really a learning curve. I mean, in part, this is because I'm doing the same type of work, but I didn't feel like there was really any learning curve in terms of getting here because it was just a different place that I was doing what I was doing already. And I think another thing that Nate said about sort of it allowing you to learn how an academic lab works, I think that's a really important point. Not just in part because that's part of what can be hard about getting to graduate school, I think, is, not understanding just sort of how to play the game. And if you can sort of already know that when you get there, I certainly think you have a leg up and feel like I was able to sort of have these opportunities because of what I experienced at Case.
Right. Thank you. And then I have there's an interesting question in the Q&A box, chat box here, that asks, in your perspective, is it better to be involved in a singular research project for longer, or do multiple projects for a shorter amount of time? So I'm actually just going to take Nate, Mahima, if you could both touch on this.
Sure. In my case and my advice, I guess not for everyone, maybe, but without too many disclaimers, I think that a singular research project for as long as possible is the best way to go in general. I think that it takes a while to get started on any project, and I think that if you can start early and stick with it and do it as much as you can in the summers and stuff, I think that gives you the best experience. It's the highest chance to see a project all the way through to publication. It lets you, see the highs and lows of research. So I think that that's what I would advise, for sure. I think if you find, obviously that's not to say like if you join a lab and it's a really bad experience or it's not for you, you're not stuck there forever. But yeah, I wouldn't. After I joined, I stuck with the lab for the rest of my time at college, and it was a great choice for me.
It's a good question, and there's definitely, pros to both options. When I joined the ATIT lab, it was actually the third lab I had joined. I had done I'd been in 2 other labs over 2 other summers, kind of this 8-week type research experience. And even though I'd been in 2 labs, I didn't really get a sense of, what the lab was like, what it is really like to do research until I was in the ATIT lab and was there long term. And when you're in grad school and you're choosing labs in grad school, it's kind of a similar thing. You do multiple small projects in different labs to decide what lab you want to join eventually. And that's great because it gives you kind of a diverse picture of different research experiences. But I do feel like you don't personally grow as much when you're doing shorter research experiences, even though you do many of them. So if I had to give advice, I would err on the side of stay in one lab for a longer period of time if that works with your schedule.
And I'd also say, I think outside of the research and project and everything, it gives an opportunity to build a relationship with a professor and your coworkers in the lab, which I think is all great. Yeah, that's my chime in.
Okay, thank you both. And then just gonna, I suppose, kind of starting to wrap things up here. What advice would you have for our prospective students, whether students that have been admitted and are looking forward to starting school in the fall and are interested in research, or prospective students that are further down the pipeline and are also interested, obviously, because they joined us for this session. I take it they're interested in research. Brian, I think think you already started touching a little bit on kind of getting your feet wet, but any other general advice for a student that is interested in being involved in college, in research in college? So I want to start with you, Brian, then Mahima and Nate.
Sure. Yeah, I think that it's sort of cliche, but I would just say find stuff you're passionate about. For me, it was sort of when I first started reaching out to labs, I was thinking, oh, well, I'll bounce around and figure out, what it is that I'd be happy doing and what it is I want to do. And then I joined a lab and realized that I didn't want to bounce around. It was sort of something that I loved doing. Something I was hoping to be able to make a career out of, something that I'm still doing. And just being able to have, those opportunities to make it not just something to put on your CV, but to make it something that you're proud of doing, and to make it something that you want to tell your friends about because you just think it's so cool. Like, I think that is, like what you want to be getting out of it.
Yeah, I can absolutely empathize with kind of talking your friends' ears off about your research. I think, Brian said it well. I would say that, when you kind of start out in college, a lot of things are new and a lot of things are exciting. And it doesn't help that that when people describe their research, sometimes it just seems so above your head. You're like, okay, I have to sift through all this and find out what I'm passionate about. I hardly know what a cell is. Like, how am I supposed to, find this research? But I think if you approach it with an open mind, you start dialogues with your professors, the people who teach your classes early on. I think that'll guide you well towards the lab that you'll eventually join. And I'll also add that in the biology department, you have a faculty advisor, and that may or may not be the person who heads your lab. You'll have one regardless of if you join a lab or not. But they're well connected with everyone, and they're a great resource for talking to, trying to identify what your interests are, and pointing you in the right direction when you have those interests identified.
Yeah, that's similar to what I was going to say. I was just going to advise to not. It's a new world, and when you start college and stuff. But I wouldn't be afraid of professors and afraid of talking to them. I think even in your first year, if you hear something that sounds interesting, or you just find out about a professor that's doing something mildly interesting to you, even if you don't know anything about it. In general, you're not going to run into nasty people when you try to talk to them. They're all looking for good students, and they want interested students. And I don't think any professor would respond negatively if you said, hey, I've never done research before, but that sounded interesting, but I don't know anything about it, but it just caught my interest. I think any professor would really love that. And even if you don't join their lab, they might say, oh, my colleague does something similar, why don't you talk to them? So yeah, I think going into it with that mindset is good. Oh, I think you might be muted.
Thank you. I sometimes forget that I mute myself when you're speaking. But anyway, this is a bit of a weird sort of ask, if you would, a different kind of ask. But just imagine you had your PIs, so Dr. Abbott, Dr. Atit, watching this session. What is one thing you'd want to tell them? So Brian, for Dr. Abbott, what would you want to say? And then gonna go on with Mahima and Nate for Dr. Atit after.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just, say thank you because, really the opportunities I got from working with my PI case are sort of the root of all of the research opportunities, and really sort of all of the career opportunities that I've been able to take advantage of since being a case. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Mahima.
Yeah, I don't think there's a way to concisely express my gratitude because it was kind of like a whirlwind, and being in that lab, but it very much changed me as a person, not just, you know, in terms of career, which it did, but also in terms of how I think. Like I mentioned before, you know, this thinking like a scientist was very appealing to me. And having someone who had the patience to teach that, and to see kind of my eagerness rewarded with equivalent eagerness, if not greater eagerness and passion, was very encouraging. And I would not be on this particular career path towards both medicine and research without my time in the lab.
Okay, thank you. Nate?
Yeah, I would echo all of that. I would just, you know, thank her. I'd say that my time in the lab was definitely the best time I had. The best thing I did in college was working in that lab. That's where I learned the most. It was the best experience. And yeah, I don't know. I can't imagine ending up where I am now if I hadn't had that experience. So yeah, do research.
Yeah, well, so I'm sure they'll be thrilled to hear all of that. And before we sort of part ways here, you know, could you kind of let us know what have you been doing to keep busy and sort of for fun during the pandemic? So again, starting in that order, Brian, Mahima, and Nate.
You know, I don't know if I have the best answers there. Lots of online cards and walking around the neighborhood I'm basically like a 6-year-old now, I think. Yeah.
Mahima.
Yeah, fortunately or unfortunately, med students have no trouble keeping busy. We have our, you know, exams coming up, so it's really been hitting the books on my end. But the weather, I'm in Minnesota right now, and when it just kind of went above 55 degrees, and this was a life changer. So you have nobody social distancing outside because everybody's so thrilled that it's finally above freezing.
Nice. Yeah, my school does a 1.5-year preclinical curriculum, so I got done with that and took boards, and I was ready to start to go into the hospital for the first time, and then they said no med students allowed in the hospital. So I joined my PhD, my thesis lab a little early, but you can't go into the lab either. So I've just been sitting at home reading and writing a review paper like many of my colleagues are doing, and doing the cliches of baking, cooking, running the dishwasher a couple times a day.
What's your favorite thing to bake?
Well, I've just been baking this very simple bread. And I tried baking sourdough once because I feel like everyone was doing it. So that's pretty
How'd that go?
I went back to just the simple yeast bread after that.
All right. Well, would like to thank you three so much. Thanks, Brian, Mahima, Nate, for joining us for this session. I think that was very informative. And I hope that our attendees today learned quite a bit about research at Case Western Reserve University from this. Obviously, we weren't able to get to everyone's questions and apologize for that. You know, if you have any additional questions about research, you can always reach us at admission@case.edu. You can also find an opportunity to book one-on-one sessions to speak with admission counselors on our website. So once again, thank you all. Wish you the best as you continue your professional journey. And thanks to our attendees for joining us today. Hope you and your families have been safe and continue to be so. And, you know, we hope you come to Case Western Reserve University. But regardless of what you decide to do, we hope you enjoy the rest of your week, certainly the rest of the month and the rest of the year. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, and everyone have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye.